So we are moving now into the second session. I'm just going to actually no. Let me just check around our panelists first. We know that Terry's mic's on and working. Kev, James, I trust you will be. Say hello.
Hello, sound check.
Yeah, a bit low in volume there, Kev.
Oh, try that. Is that better?
That would be doing visor down, my friend. Not
it helps.
visor
It helps if you put the Darth Vader helmet down. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah. Feel the force, Kev. Feel the force. And Pete Nicholls.
I love you loads, Glenn. Did you hear that?
Yeah, got it. Loud and clear. And I can, even through Zoom, I can feel the sincerity. There we go. So thanks you guys for being here. So these are I'll introduce these guys formally in a minute. That was just by way of a sound check. So what I'm going to do is, so the speakers know, I'm going to be sharing some slides for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll come back to you, and I'll introduce you properly then. So I'm just going to share the model we're talking about today, the male-friendly services model that we've created. And interesting just to look at that, reflecting on what Rebecca was talking about. You know, there's a project, it targets men directly, it meets them where they are, it uses male-friendly language, it's not seeing them as a problem. There's a little bit of, you know, it builds social connection because it's a group setting. It provides men with the knowledge and the information they need to help themselves. It uses drinking, which we could definitely say is a male-friendly activity, and it works to men's strengths. Men like to be solution-focused. They like to hang out in pubs. These are assets and strengths that we can lever. So we're going to move now. This morning we looked at in the first session we looked at the blue part of this wheel. The promotion aspects, and we're now going to move into the culture piece. And just to reinforce for those joining the conversation, all these characteristics of male-friendly services, they don't sit in silos, they overlap with each other, but sometimes it's good to break them down so we can hone in on different aspects. So we're going to very much look at the culture of male-friendly services now. And we've picked out 3 key aspects that we see over and over again in services, in the culture of services that seem to be really good at engaging with men. And that's that they don't view men as a problem. It's not their starting point. They often combine giving help with getting help. So it's not just about being the passive recipient of someone else's help. It's about having the opportunity to help others in the process of getting help. And they often build social connection amongst men, as Rebecca's project in the pub with groups did. So just to dive into those 3 aspects just a little bit deeper, and what I love about these slides, by the way, is these aren't iStock pictures. These are pictures of different projects that we know are working with men effectively. So one's I think that one's one of Rebecca's groups in a function room of the pub. This is a project called the Men's Table. They have meetings around meals once a month. They have a model for creating social groups around the country, set around just your kitchen table. So in terms of not viewing men as a problem, I think this is a really key point. I sometimes say, when you look at our narrative around gender and social issues, in very simple terms, it often turns out like this. We tend to view it as women have problems and men are the problem. And we've already talked about the narrative around violence, and that's a really prime example of how we focus on women as the victims and men as the perpetrators. And of course, there are female victims of violence and there are male perpetrators of violence, and the reality of our lives is also more complex than that. And that simple idea, the idea that we often view women as having problems and men being problems, is now getting backed up by research into moral stereotypes that finds that collectively we tend to be more sympathetic towards women who have particular issues than we do to men who have the same issues. We tend to blame men for their problems, and we tend to expect men to solve their problems. And that maps into the masculine norm of sort of agency and independence. But that's something that we all create collectively. So that's the culture that we all create, that leads men in a positive way, often to be more independent and agentic. But actually, when it comes to trying to provide help to men, means we're not we're more tolerant of the harm that happens to men, and we're not as likely to target services at them. So there's this two-sided coin where men don't get help, but then also we don't give help to men, and that's why our focus is on how can we get better at giving help to men rather than just being annoyed at men for not getting help. And so we often find that services, the starting point is not to view blokes as a problem, because, you know, why would you want to go anywhere to get help and support off a bunch of people who see you as a problem? So often they focus on on positive benefits, they focus on the strengths they already have, and often you find that the individual staff have got a really sort of positive attitude towards blokes. They themselves are male friendly. Combining getting help with giving help. Well, some of the guys we've got here today will just talk about that. So I'm not going to say too much other than to highlight that this is a massive part often of forming a good relationship with men. That it's a two-way process, not just you, the help giver, and them, the help receiver. And then finally, they often provide an opportunity to build social connection between men, which in itself is massively beneficial. Whatever issue you're trying to address, if you can actually provide opportunities for men to build social connection, we know good social connection and social bonds are health giving. In fact, some research suggests that social isolation and loneliness can be as bad as your health as smoking. So anything that's actually building social connection is in itself beneficial beyond whatever additional service that you're trying to apply. So there's the model again. And so in this conversation, we're going to focus on those three aspects: not seeing men as a problem, combining getting help with giving help, and helping to build social connection between men. I'll stop sharing the screen, and then I'm going to go to each of our guests. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to give you a minute to introduce yourself. And then we'll come back to you and ask you to talk a bit more about the work that you do and some of the ways it applies or doesn't apply to the model we've got here. And I think I'll start with you, Terry. So Terry Cornick is the founder of Mr. Perfect. And the reason I've asked him here is because he's doing awesome work, and his project has gone gangbusters and has spread all over the country to something like 30 sites now. And it's all about building social connection for men at a grassroots level, all done on a voluntary basis, and something that I really want to celebrate because it's an awesome project. And that's why I've got you here, Terry. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Will do. Thank you so much, Glenn. So I'm Terry Cornick, founder, CEO of Mr. Perfect. We run community barbecues around Australia. We started with one and had no plan I had no thought or strategy that it would be where it is now, but clearly there was a demand for what we have. That has now gone to almost 30 running until COVID, and we certainly have a few more that will start post that time now. What we found, I guess, is it has all been about social connection. Originally, it started about my story and how I didn't have that option or wasn't given that option professionally or clinically by doctors. They didn't even suggest anything to do with social connection. So that kind of sparked the thought for me that if I wasn't getting that and I was reaching out for help, then God knows how many other guys just had no idea where to start. So the barbecue, although it's just a vehicle that works for us, it's the central hub. We get people around it for 2 hours. It's non-clinical. Like we say, and Glenn just pointed out very importantly, I sometimes question it and I'm self-critical and go, but we could do more. But if all we're doing is providing 2 hours for guys to get together and have social connection, you'd be amazed how many people don't have those 2 hours in a month or don't have time to do it or make excuses for it. So we become that hub for it. So that's what we are and what we do.
Great. Fantastic, Terry. And we look forward to hearing more about how that's going shortly. I'll come to Kev next. When I first started looking at sort of research into barriers to men accessing help and support, about 10 years ago or so, one of the formative bits of research I found was research into men in aged care settings in the UK, and I hadn't thought of it before then. But it was all focused on how very much the activities and the whole sort of culture of those places are very feminine, and how often you get blokes just isolated on their own. And so when I heard about Kev and the work that he's doing in Queensland with Circle of Men, I thought, oh, this is beautiful. This is the kind of love and support and care you would want for any older man in your family who was found himself in an aged care setting. I'll allow you to introduce yourself, Kevin, and give us a little bit of a glimpse into what you do. Just take about a minute for now, and we'll come back to you after that.
Yeah, many thanks for the introduction, Glenn. And Circle of Men currently, once the COVID-19 crisis is over, we'll be back into 15 nursing homes in the Brisbane area. We're a small bunch of around 50 to 60 volunteers, and for 90 minutes a week, we generally go in and talk to the elderly men who are, as Glenn has pointed out, often socially isolated and suffering from loneliness and depression. And that's the mission at our heart, is to allow these guys to connect with each other. Glenn mentioned so eloquently that mental health is very much linked to physical health, and no more so than this is apparent with the elderly men. And most of the people I talk to, they're anywhere between 65 to 105 years of age, and they've got a wealth of life experiences, and we want to tease this out of them, because the model that we've seen today, they view themselves as a problem, and they say to me, oh, you don't want to hear my problems? And I said, yes, I do. That's exactly what I want to hear, and I want to know more about you. So we validate their past, and we use reminiscing as a great tool. But there's so much I could say, and it's so important, the health, especially the mental health of our elderly. And I'll just finish with one saying I heard recently, which is, it ain't weak to speak. And that is so true of any age group. Thank you. Back to you.
Great. Thanks for being here, Kev. So big thumbs up from Bob there. By the way, you can use your reactions button as well to do something like that if you're not familiar with Zoom. But the good old thumbs up works as well. Third and finally, but not least, I'll come to Pete Nicholls. Pete and I have a kind of love-hate relationship. So if you hear any snarkiness between us, it's because we actually know each other we know each other too well, and sometimes forget to leave our friendship at home. But I love this man dearly, and also respect his work. We first met through our shared interest in working with separated dads in the UK. I love him so much that he came to Australia first, and I followed him. And that's why we now have to live in separate states because of the police order. But he's doing fantastic work heading up Parents Beyond Breakup, which runs the Dads in Distress support groups, which I'm a massive fan of. And as well as being his friend, I'm also on the board at the moment, so I'm kind of his boss. So now you behave yourself, young man, and do a very good job.
Okay, well, I better stick to the script then, since my boss is in the right. We're Parents Beyond Breakup. Most people know us as Dads in Distress. We were started 20 years ago. We are at heart a suicide prevention support service, but our focus is on separating parents. 95% of those parents that walk through the door are dads. We operate in the real world through in-person groups scattered across the country that meet on a weekly basis. It's all volunteers, a little bit like Terry's kind of setup. We also increasingly recently work online with groups, and we operate a telephone line as well, 6 days a week. Pretty much everything we do is peers. It's guys who've been through it, helping other guys who are currently going through it. So that's the quick and dirty overview. Only other thing I would say to you is that if it's of interest to people, roughly we do quite a bit of measurement. 51% of people that come to us the first time are actually in a state of saying that they are suicidal. Within about 3 visits, that drops down to almost 0. So there is a little bit of magic that happens at these groups. They happen at a lot of these groups that I hear about online here, but happy to share some of that insight as we go on.
Great, thanks, Pete. Thanks for being here. and thanks to all of our guests. So we're looking at sort of 3 areas of this model. I'll just share it again, just to remind you what we're looking at right now before we. So I'm going to ask the guests in a moment to talk a bit more about their project, and you can talk about it however you want. But I really welcome it if you sort of lent into these sort of 3 areas and identified and highlighted, ways in which that might be reflected in your service. I think we can clearly all see that building social connection is fundamental to what all of these projects are doing. And as Kevin said, it's worth remembering that in itself, and Terry, that in itself is a positive health giving benefit. But I can also see as well that you all rely on volunteers, and many of those volunteers are, I'm sure that they're getting benefit from in the process of giving help as a volunteer. So I'm already starting to see how your services really do lean into this part of the model. But I'll let you say in your own words. Tell us your story. Tell us what you're up to and what you're doing, and why it is that you think your services are so successful at working and engaging with men, compared to other services that might struggle to actually engage with men. And I'll do the same order. I'll come to you first, Kev. Sorry, come to you first, Terry. That was the order, wasn't it? It's been a long week. I apologise. I'm not functioning 100%. Over to you.
I can only imagine. So I'll go with my kind of gut feel instead of any sort of stats or science we have around this. So when we first started it, I think I mentioned I had no background information. I just had my gut feel of this might work. Even though ironically I'm a bit more of an introvert and I didn't love like social connection, but I knew I needed it. Like I knew I needed that as something that would be good for me. Why does what we do work now? The more we've investigated it, got feedback from people who come, other people who've actually done. I found actual scientific studies now and psychological studies about gathering places and gathering around a barbecue or a fire or whatever it might be. I can only say when I used to do the first barbecue and it was really kicking off, and maybe when I returned to do the Sydney one, we did a big Christmas one last year, and 50 people came and it was incredible. And I was doing the barbecue, I'm cooking away and I'm taking it all in and being thoughtful as ever, but I could see that people would ask me my story, or they'd say, "Oh, so how did you start, Mr. Perfect?" Or what? And I would give them small snippets of it, or as I'm cooking, I wasn't looking them direct in the eye. I wasn't focused intently one-on-one with them. They weren't expected to tell me anything. It was just little bits of the story. And you could almost see their brain wearing away, and they might come over a little bit sheepish at first, the first time they come. And they come around to me at the end of the barbecue and like shake my hand one-on-one and say, "Thank you, that was really sort of powerful for me." And I was like, oh, it's just me, telling a little bit about my story. And I could tell that it kind of resonated with them and reflected. And then inevitably what would happen is the next time round they would come and they would say, they'd open up a bit more, or they'd offer to help on the barbecue. And then the next time they would come, the third month, they'd come and they would probably chat to a couple more people. And before you knew it, they became part of that community and felt a lot more engaged in it. And regardless of what they'd said about their story, just being there and being around that environment where they weren't judged, they weren't expected to be something, they weren't at work, for example, putting on a mask. They weren't given, clinical advice and told, "Oh, you're doing this wrong, you should be doing this." And, they weren't preached at. That seems to have worked for us. And it's only now we've gone back. I've actually got in my day job, ironically, I work with doctors and mental health professionals and GPs, and those two worlds are colliding more. So although we completely say we're non-clinical, we've come up recently with some, I guess, challenges, but good ones, to make us think about, well, if we're not offering that next step of the service, how do we see ourselves in the landscape and the continuum? And we'd like to think we're at the pre-crisis right at this end. The next step might be a men's group, a more closed off scenario for someone when they're ready for that step. The next step might be, education around something. The next step might be clinical example. That's kind of how we see us. So what we've done is, where we can't answer those questions, we've engaged clinical professionals to answer those questions on our live streams or disseminate the information via our blogs or whatever it might be. But the general message we get is authenticity, no egos, We have a vast range of backgrounds of people coming. It's not too blokey, but some of them have different demographics. So some of our barbecues might be quite really male dominated. Others are big family affairs and a community thing. So we've got one in regional Victoria, which gets 20, 30 people going, and the whole community then, people are bringing their sons and kids and everything. And it's just become something they can all engage in. I don't know. I'd love to say I know exactly what that secret sauce is, but I think that's where it's worked. Yeah.
That's great, Terry. I think, there's a bigger factor here, which is something that we covered on Saturday when you came along, and you're getting some applause there from Greg Smith down in Ulverston. Good to see you, Greg. Men Care too, and from Nick in Tasmania Men Sheds too. We sort of loosely called it the men's mental health movement, and it reminds me of the men's sheds movement 25 years ago, because we just take it for granted now. There's over 1,000 men's sheds in Australia. There's more men's sheds than there are McDonald's in Australia, and men's sheds have spread around the world, and we just take it for granted. And you really notice it when you travel around the country and you go to every little community, like my town with 2,000 people, it's got a men's shed. Every little community's got a men's shed. But it didn't used to be like that. There was a time when there was one, and then two, and then there was maybe 15 or 20 around the country, and they bubbled up sort of in an uncoordinated fashion because it's something that men wanted and needed and valued. And what we're seeing, and it was about not just about the project, it was about having purpose and social connection and somewhere to go. And what we're seeing now is more and more younger men creating these types of social groups and social networks, like the Man Walk, like Mr. Perfect, like Grab Life by the Balls, like the Men's Table. There's loads of examples, and it's really a Tough Guy Butt Club is another one. There's loads of these examples, and it's not been spotted yet outside of our sector.
Yeah,
it's something that's actually this is men's sheds are now recognised as not just a really valuable community resource, but also a health giving resource, and they're funded out of the health department.
Yeah.
Well,
I think you hit the note. You just hit it on the head there. So I think it wasn't maybe for men's shed. It's not a problem that they weren't there or doing great work. It's that this has come to the fore now that all the noise around this is going, well, actually, these things already existed. It was just perhaps the marketing or the consciousness level of everyone and sharing it on our social media and talking about this more. It's becoming more and more apparent that there are a lot of resources out there, and that comes with good and it comes with challenges as well, making sure we communicate properly what's good for everyone else. Because I went straight in at 30 and it was effectively, I could have been suicidal. I was, and I had moments where I went, well, I've got to tackle this somehow, but I went straight to the end point. So it was like straight to clinical, here's a psychiatrist, here's this. And then I worked my way back in my head and went, surely there should have been a softer entry to this at an earlier stage. So that's kind of how we've thought about it. And although my story was more about crisis at the start, the softer point should be when someone first thinks, hold on a minute, I'm not ready for this, but maybe I need to open up a little bit, or maybe I'm just curious and I want to go along to one of these things and listen. We get guys who come and literally don't say a word for 2 hours, and then they go off and I go, oh shit, did we do something wrong? And then they say, I get a message afterwards saying, that was incredible. I haven't had that feeling forever. And I go, well, you didn't say that, but then I go, it's not always verbal. I get that from me, you communicate in different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a really great point, Terry. There's this sort of like obsession with how do we get men to talk? And of course, talking is a really good tool, but actually when you look at research on what men do to cope when they're not traveling so well, talking is not the number one thing that they say they do.
Yeah,
there's lots of other things: being around other people, reframing their situation with humor, being active, helping someone else. Yeah. Helping someone else comes ahead of talking to someone else in men's list of how they cope with mental health issues, and that's really hard for a system that's very reliant on getting patients one-to-one and talking to them to grasp. It's like, well, how do you get them to talk, and what do you talk about, and how do you talk safely? Well, that's not the only way to help people. Yeah. But definitely. What's great, it's not an either or. And what I like about what you're putting down here is that you're talking about it being an addition to what else is out there and a connecting point. And you said, like your phrase, a hard entry point. So you're talking about creating softer entry points and softer connections to services by building stuff from the community up. But also then what we also need is male-friendly support from the top down, which does the stuff at whatever stage men are on their particular journey in this case.
And that may actually lessen, because I work in clinical, like in my day job, I work with doctors. I see the strains on this system, and no matter how good our doctors are in this country and how talented they are, like they are the best in the world. I don't doubt that at all. But the whole system that's been set up for it, it's like suddenly you pile on all this weight at that end. Well, guess what's going to happen? We're going to, as we go to get experiences in that system, we're going to say it's crap because we feel like no one cares and they're not listening, because they have to smash through all these patients and they're already overloaded themselves and they have their own mental health problems. Yeah. So there needs to be this kind of dispersing of the load, I think. That's the way I think about it. But
now, spot on. I'm going to move to Kevin now just for time, but my final comeback on that is we've really seen this in the response to COVID-19. Over $1 billion put into mental health, and most of it is focused on one-to-one top-down support, not grassroots up. And we're missing something there massively. So Kev, tell us your story. Tell us about your service. Why is it working? What are you doing? What's the secret barbecue sauce over at the Circle of Men?
The secret barbecue sauce is spicy. Actually,
eyes are down. Have you got your...
I've done it again. We're getting used to Zoom, and I'm trying to
load, Kev. Lock and load,
and I'm trying to teach 90-year-olds how to do this, and I can't do it myself. Thank you again. Yes, how do we make men talk? It's very difficult, and while the work that we do is a very specific age group, men who are retired, I like the theme today, which is actually meeting men where they are, and that's what we do. We go into the aged care facility, and 4 years ago when I started with Circle of Men and now look after some of their recruiting aspects and social media, I was fascinated to learn that 90% across the board in Australia with our nursing home models, 90% of the population are women. And it's purely due to an age demographic. I didn't realize that men go into nursing homes generally at around the age of 85. When my grandparents and your parents and grandparents were alive 30, 40 years ago, they entered a lot younger, but we have the over 50s retirement villages now, and men are entering as a last resort, shall we say, once they've lost their significant other, perhaps. And it's very difficult and lonely and socially isolating for them. And I think the greatest thing that Circle of Men does is provide a safe place for these men to meet each other in a room outside of what their normal environments and their four walls are. They often say to me, these men, I'm in prison here. I don't like it. I didn't want to come here. I came here kicking and dragging and screaming and all that. But they meet other men who share the same experiences as them. And many of the fellas that I talk to are in their 80s and 90s. They come from a generation where it wasn't trendy or cool or acceptable to speak about your emotions. We call them the greatest generation, and they're very stoic, these guys. And something that really resonates with me particularly is point 2 in this model that has been shared, was giving help means getting help. And I'll give a quick example. One of our gentlemen who's in his 90s, he lost his wife who he was living with in the nursing home, and it was very distressing to him, and he was always talking about that, and we gave him an avenue and an environment to do so safely. And it also helped one of our volunteers who just lost his wife recently, a week or two prior. And these two now are best mates. And that is wonderful, makes my heart glad, because they found each other. And what I would like to see is this going on, not so much with the volunteers and the residents, but I want the residents. And we see this happening. I want the residents to talk to each other. And I mentioned this the other day, when we are not there, we're only there for 90 minutes a week. We want them to support each other when we're not there. And this is happening because we give and then they give back themselves, our volunteers, our residents. But this only happens if we give a safe environment and we provide that trust. It takes months sometimes when we get a new resident to come along. I don't want to go up there and talk to those old blokes. I'm not as old as them, but I don't have the same problems. But you've all heard this before, and it takes a while to get them to open up. But once they do, it all comes pouring out. And I think Terry said sometimes they go away and they don't say anything. This happens particularly where I am, but weeks or months later, once they've processed all this, they say, I really don't know where I'd be now had I not been coming to these sessions on a weekly basis. My wife's gone. I don't have any relatives who are nearby. They don't come and see me. There's a lot of really heartwarming stories I hear, and I'd love to see this go national, but it's a great model, but we need to provide that environment and have a great working relationship with the staff there. So there's two things going on here. We're providing the service, but that only happens if we have the opportunity to do so in the nursing home. But yeah, I could talk about this for a long time. Meeting men where they are, showing your vulnerability and helping them to open up, and then everybody becomes mates and we try to support each other. What is spoken in the room stays in the room, and we make this very clear because we do occasionally get into some deep conversations and we have a lot of laughter too. So there's crying and there's laughter, and permission has been given to do so. But back to you. Back to you, Glenn.
It's great stuff, Kev. One of my favourite, thank you so much. One of my favourite days of the summit so far is the day when we focused on working with older men and having all these different organisations working with older men in different ways. Many of them run by older men as volunteers. It was the most wonderful day to be in the company of all these legends doing fantastic work around Australia, and yet there's scope for so much more work. And my heart goes out to those guys in aged care settings who don't have this type of support and connection. And it's really important. We were talking earlier about how it's important when we're talking about dads, not to try and be inclusive by saying parents, but actually to focus on dads, because you need to actually target dads. And a lot of what we're talking about here is the value of actually putting a gender lens and focusing on men's experience. Dads, we're going to hear about in a moment, whether it's dads who are grieving, as one of our participants raised earlier, whether it's older men. And I noticed a couple of years ago, there was an acknowledgement from the Department of Health that the older men have the highest rate of suicide. And then the response was to say, we're putting, I don't know, it was $100 plus million into two things. One was mental health support, and the other was targeting that in aged care settings. And you instantly went, well, firstly, most people in aged care settings are women. And secondly, we know that most older male suicide is more likely to be linked to physical health and social distress than it is to mental health. And so because someone didn't actually ask themselves, what's a male-friendly way to make sure we put funding out there which reaches older men, that funding's put out into the system and will mostly miss the mark. And that really frustrates me, because it's such a simple thing to do, to actually ask yourself before you spend the money, how do we reach the demographic which is most at risk here? And you know, men over 85, their rate of suicide is 7 times higher than women over 85. And we're really missing the mark on that. And if we're missing the mark on suicide, I'm sure we're missing a mark on all these other things: mental health, emotional well-being, social well-being, and all the rest of it. So I massively value and honor and respect the work you're doing, Kev. It's really important. And then on a personal level, the biggest issue I've ever faced in my life is being a dad and going through separation. So I'm such a big fan of work with separated dads. And Pete, the floor is yours to share why what you're doing works.
Well, look, I've been through it myself as well. So, I speak as a peer as well as you do, Glenn. And actually, the very fact that we're in this sector says something about, tapping into those who have gone there before. And certainly, from my perspective, I mean, the question is really, who's more dedicated to helping a traumatized man than a traumatized man that was helped by his peers wanting to give something back? It's an astonishingly powerful emotion. In fact, I think one of my biggest challenges as CEO is stopping these guys from burning themselves out. Now, my background is in the commercial sector, and I would have loved people to have given an extra couple of hours a week you know, when they're paid. With these guys, they're not being paid anything, and you cannot stop them working. They're doing way too much and putting themselves at risk of vicarious trauma. So there is something exceptional about tapping into the world of peers. That's certainly true. In terms of why they do it, there's a whole bunch of reasons I think that they do come forward. I mean, certainly in our situation where we're looking at separated dads, it's a particular situation. It's not necessarily mental health. It's more of a situational distress or social kind of distress factor. A lot of these guys have, you know, lost their sense of purpose as a father, as a provider, as a protector. To being what they've gone through. So quite often, once they've been helped, they see a role that they can put their heart and soul into where they can give back. And suddenly they get their sense of purpose back, and their eyes just light up. It's quite astonishing to witness that. And look, and lastly, in terms of the kind of conversation around why that actually works so well, you know, tapping into the world of peers, I think both Terry and Kev spoke about it in different ways, and I really did think what they said was powerful. One was the guy that just sits there and listens and observes, and you have no idea how much they're absorbing. But there's also something Kev spoke about, which was safety. And I think if we look at the particular situation that we're dealing with, and I'm sure it'll be analogous to others as well, is that when you are lost and you are alone and feeling isolated, you're scared, and you lose trust in officialdom. And it's hard to go to a doctor or to a police officer or a lawyer in the case of dads. Then who the hell can you trust? Well, I can trust others like me. And so it's a much softer entry point, to use Terry's kind of terminology. And I think it's underrated how powerful that is. I'll speak to, or even just sit in the room with, another guy that's gone through what I've gone through. And I don't feel I need to talk or explain myself or, you know, justify that I'm not an evil, angry man. I can just sit here and listen to what's going on and learn and absorb something. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
No, that's perfect. I think the point, all of that's fantastic, Pete. And the point you're talking to there, particularly at the end, is not viewing that man as a problem. Is actually, and that you don't necessarily get how extraordinary that is, because the public narrative around a separated dad, and this will be true of lots of different situations that dads find them in, but the public narrative around the separated dads, particularly the separated dads who's got limited or no access to his kids, is he must have done something wrong. Is that he must be a danger to his kids. And I know one thing, and I know plenty of dads who've messed up and all the rest of it, but I know one thing about every single separated dad that I've sat down with, is that the reason he's sitting down in that group, trying to get help and support and advice, is because he loves his kids unconditionally and is committed to being the best dad he can be. Now, he might be falling short of that, but I actually would say that to a dad at some point. So I don't know you from Adam. I don't know what you've done right or wrong, what you've been through, but I do know you love your kids unconditionally and you absolutely want to be the best dad in the world. And it always gets to them because it's truth. And because actually at that moment in time, no one's saying that about them. People are saying, you know, they're a problem, they're doing this wrong, they need to change that. They're not even saying it to themselves because they're beating themselves up. And so that thing about not seeing men as a problem, I often use the phrase, you don't see men as a problem, see them as their potential. And that doesn't mean being soft. It doesn't mean saying not dealing with issue. If they're showing up in ways that there is behaviors that are problematic and not helping them or putting others at risk, of course it's got to be dealt with. But as a human being, you meet them unconditionally, with unconditional regard, as someone who has got huge potential as a human being and clearly wants to grow because and wants to make a difference for themselves and the people in their lives because they're sitting in a room with you. And so that not viewing blokes as a problem is a massive part of this for me, and it's a real skill actually, because it actually comes on that, and it's therapy. It's like being non-judgmental, right? But there's something more than just not judging. It's actually really, really valuing that human being and their potential. And I think you get that in support groups, peer support groups, because other people have been through the same stuff that you've been through. And so you don't have to explain it to them. You don't have to justify it. They just go, yeah, you've been through the same war. And I'm just going to share this. And this is the kind of message I get all the time, right? I've got an email about 10:05, just as I was starting this today. Glenn, seeking some wisdom around a father looking for a group that offers support after mums withholding children and laying false allegations of abuse. Is there anywhere we can send him, right? And so, and the first thing I said, I may have frozen there. Hopefully, I've come back. Yeah, the first thing that I said was, Dads in Distress Support Services, their phone line guys have been through it themselves, and then I sent the link. But it was that point. I know those guys have been through it themselves. So those guys are going to take really good care of that bloke, whatever he's going through. So, I'm going to open it up to Greg. You want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Cherry and Mr. Perfect. I'm the Newcastle coordinator since September with them. I met the guys last year when they got an award, and can I just say, as a men's project, they are so well organised and so supportive of all the hosts of their barbecues. They're really professional and they do a great job on that. But they're a really fantastic, easy entry point for a lot of guys. The first one we ran in Newcastle, there were a couple of young guys, about 27, turned up. And we had a conversation about how hard it is to live in a housing trust environment. And they said, oh, this is good. Do you have guest speakers? I said, no. Do you have people who talk about stuff? We said, no. They said, oh, this is really good. The unstructured nature of it is fantastic. It just suits men who come along. And in December, Mr. Perfect organised a whole lot of hosts around New South Wales to a barbecue behind Central Station that I went to. And it was fantastic to be there with 40 or 50 people. There was a hell of a lot of love in the park that afternoon because Mr. Perfect's created almost a family of Mr. Perfect hosts, and we all get on. And you've created that. You've created a fantastic project, and I can't speak too highly of it. It's great, simple, but great.
Thanks, Greg. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I'm just going to say hello to Darren Black and make sure his tech's all working. G'day, Darren.
Hi, Glenn.
Great, perfect. We'll come back. How you doing, my friend?
Yeah, good.
Good to see you. We'll come to you in a couple of minutes, okay? Just want to round up this session.
That's fine. Sure. I'm listening to the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, anyone else want to share? I'm just going to. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to reshare the model that we're talking about to orientate ourselves in the conversation where we're up to. I think you guys have done a really good job of speaking to that. So we're in the sort of the red part of the model, and you can see all right through that conversation it's all been all about building social connection, providing fantastic opportunities for guys to give help as well as getting help. We were just talking at the end of Pete's bit there about not seeing these men as problems. Anyone else want to share from experience? I have a question for our guests before we move on to the next section. Is Bob? Are you moving in to say something, Bob? You need to unmute, Bob.
Oh, bless you, brothers.
Hey, Bob.
I'll put this down. Excuse me. I'm cooking at the same time. A few things. One, Kev, wonderful work with seniors, men, because we know the single determining factor.
Bob, you've got a wonderful face. Tilt your computer so we can see it. We want to see your face, my friend.
God bless you. Okay, I didn't shave, but I figured I'm with you guys.
No, that's okay. Let's see your face. But I know you've shown your face at other events. That's it.
Oh, that would be me.
There you are.
And, okay. Anyway, thanks, Glenn. Just some short feedback. Kev, wonderful view of working with old men, because we know the single most important factor in longevity is relationships. That's it. That's the number one. And two, so bravo. Terry, fabulous work about soft landings because we're going against centuries of kind of internal psychological formatting of how men relate to each other, you know, and the soft landing is a wonderful entry point. Next, Pete, I had an organization, Fathers and Families, in the 90s where I work with divorce. I still work with fathers globally. And what we found useful was not just a clinical approach, but constructing male-friendly professionals. You needed a family law attorney who could interpret the laws. You needed an accountant who could manage the finances. You needed a therapist to work with the children. And the new collaborative divorce models where they take a family in crisis and move them to healing, basically moving from conflict to helping this family. So that's kind of the short of that. I just wanted to comment, but it's like, I've been, as Glenn knows, been watching this every day. I'm a foreigner. I'm from California, hiding out from the pandemic. And there's not a better place but Tasmania here. I do want to recommend a book called Stiffed. And it's by a woman named Susan Faludi. Now, she wrote the seminal piece of work in the feminist movement in the 70s called Backlash, where she changed her attention to men, and she wrote this incredible book called Stiffed. And it has more to do with our evolution as men and what's uniquely important.
Brilliant, Bob.
Good night.
Yes.
When Glenn says that, I know it's time to stop.
Beautifully done.
Wonderful to meet you guys, I got to tell you. And
beautifully done. So thank you for taking time to acknowledge each of our speakers as well, Bob. You've done that beautifully. So we'll say thanks very much, guys. Do make sure you pop any details you want in the chat box before you go. If you can stick around for the next 45-50 minutes and contribute to the conversation, please do. If you have to go, you have to go. So, but I'll say official thank you to Kev, to Terry, and to Pete.